It starts like any other humid summer evening in the city of Oakhaven, a place where the gloss of downtown skyscrapers barely conceals simmering racial tensions and a police department known more for its gut instinct policing than its community relations. Michael Evans, a young black graphic designer with a passion for community gardening and a gentle smile, is driving home from his studio, windows down, music playing softly. Then, flashing blue lights. A routine traffic stop. Officer. Karen Miller, a well-regarded cop on the force, approaches. A misunderstood gesture. A split-second decision, clouded by years of biased training and locker room rhetoric. A single shot. Michael Evans lies dead on the pavement. The official story quickly forms: furtive movement, non-compliance. Officer feared for her life. The blue wall closes ranks. But what the department, the union, the city doesn't know, what Officer Miller herself barely comprehends in the immediate aftermath, is that beneath the uniform, a conscience is about to awaken. The hero cop who neutralized a perceived threat is about to become haunted by the truth of her own bias, a truth that will compel her to make a late-night confession so explosive it will detonate the department's carefully constructed narrative and expose the rot within. A storm of truth triggered by one officer's unbearable guilt is coming. Stick around. This isn't just a story about a shooting, it's about what happens when the system's own enforcer becomes its most damning witness. And hey, as this story begins, let us know where you're joining us from tonight. City, state, country. Your presence helps us understand the reach of these vital conversations. Drop it in the comments below, ready to find out exactly how it all went down. Buckle up. Let's dive right in. Oakhaven shimmered under a hazy summer sky, a city of stark contrasts. Gleaming financial towers scraped the clouds downtown, symbols of prosperity and progress. But just a few miles away, in neighborhoods like Willow Creek, where Michael Evans lived, the streets were a little rougher, the opportunities scarcer, and the relationship between the community and the Oakhaven Police Department was frayed, to put it mildly. Decades of aggressive broken windows policing, racial profiling disguised as proactive patrols, and a string of controversial incidents had bred deep mistrust. The OPD, while officially touting community engagement, quietly fostered a culture where an officer's gut instinct, often a euphemism for racial bias, was implicitly trusted, sometimes even lauded, especially in high-crime designated areas. Training often emphasized officer safety above all else, subtly reinforcing a warrior mentality, painting certain demographics as inherently more threatening. This was the simmering backdrop against which ordinary lives unfolded. Michael Evans, 28, was anything but a statistic or a stereotype. He was a gentle soul with a quick, easy laugh and a talent for visual design that was just beginning to gain recognition. He worked diligently as a freelance graphic designer, his small apartment filled with sketchbooks, color palettes, and the soft glow of his oversized monitor. His passion project, however, lay beyond the screen. He was a driving force behind the Willow Creek Community Garden, transforming a neglected vacant lot into a vibrant oasis of fresh vegetables and flowers. He spent his evenings and weekends there, teaching kids from the neighborhood how to plant seeds, tend a garden, and find beauty and sustenance in the earth. He believed in growth, in nurturing, in the quiet power of community. He was known for his patience with the children, his willingness to share his knowledge, and his infectious optimism. He wasn't politically active in a confrontational way, but his art, his community work, they were his quiet forms of resistance, his way of building something positive in a world that often felt harsh and unforgiving. He had a minor brush with the law in his late teens, possession of a small amount of marijuana, a youthful indiscretion that resulted in probation and a conviction he'd long since put behind him, though it remained a permanent, if dormant, part of his record. He drove a slightly battered but reliable 10-year-old sedan, always careful to keep his registration and insurance up to date, acutely aware that any minor infraction could lead to an unpleasant encounter in Oakhaven. He wasn't naive about the realities of policing in his city, but he tried to live his life with integrity and hope, focusing on creation rather than conflict. On this particular Tuesday evening, he was driving home from a successful meeting at a downtown gallery that had expressed interest in showcasing some of his community garden photography. He felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, a lightness in his chest. He had a new idea for a mural project for the garden. He was thinking about what to make for dinner. An ordinary man on an ordinary evening, unaware that his ordinary life was about to be extinguished by an officer's fatally flawed gut instinct. The flashing lights appeared in Michael's rearview mirror abruptly, harshly illuminating the interior of his sedan. His heart gave an immediate, familiar jolt. He glanced at his speedometer, precisely the limit. He checked his mirrors. No sudden moves, no obvious infractions. He sighed quietly, a sound of weary resignation, and signaled, pulling over smoothly to the curb on a dimly lit side street just a few blocks from his apartment. He killed the engine, rolled down his window, halfway, and placed his hands on the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 position, the practiced ritual of de-escalation. He waited. The patrol car door opened, and Officer Karen Miller emerged. Mid-30s, athletic build, Miller had a reputation within the department as a competent, no-nonsense officer, well regarded by her superiors for her decisiveness, though some younger colleagues found her approach a little too quick to escalate. She approached Michael's car, her flashlight beam cutting through the dusk, playing across his face. "License and registration, please," she said, her voice flat, professional, but devoid of any warmth. Michael nodded. "Evening, officer. Reaching for my wallet in my right pocket, and the registration is in the glove compartment." He narrated his movements slowly, deliberately, keenly aware of the need to avoid any sudden gestures that could be misinterpreted. He retrieved his license, then leaned across to open the glove compartment. It was a bit cluttered. Old receipts, a tire pressure gauge, a small first aid kit. His registration papers were tucked inside a plastic sleeve. As he reached for them, a small silver multi-tool he kept in the glove compartment, a gift from his father, useful for everything from opening packages to minor car repairs, slipped from amidst the papers and clattered onto the passenger seat floor. It wasn't a weapon, just a standard Leatherman-style tool, but in the dim light its metallic glint might have caught Miller's eye in a particular way. Michael, focused on retrieving the registration, barely registered its fall. He found the papers and held them out, along with his license. Officer Miller took the documents, her flashlight beam moving from the papers to Michael's face, then briefly into the car's interior. Her eyes, Marcus couldn't see them clearly behind the glare, seemed to narrow slightly. "This vehicle current?" she asked, though the registration was clearly valid. "Yes, officer, all up to date." "Where you coming from tonight?" "Just left a meeting at the Arden Gallery downtown, heading home." "What kind of meeting?" Her questions felt like an interrogation, not a traffic stop. Her posture was tense, almost confrontational. Michael felt his own unease growing. He tried to keep his voice calm. "It was about a potential photography exhibit, officer." He decided to reach down, pick up the multi-tool, and place it back in the glove compartment before closing it. Just to be tidy, to avoid it rolling around. It was a harmless, almost unconscious gesture. He said, "Just a sec, officer, something fell," and leaned slightly to his right, his left hand still on the wheel, his right hand reaching down towards the passenger floorboard where the silver tool lay. That was the gesture. That was the moment. Officer Miller, her senses perhaps already heightened by the high crime area designation of this neighborhood in her mind, her training screaming about furtive movements, her implicit biases perhaps, painting Michael's slight lean and reach not as retrieving a dropped item, but as reaching for a concealed weapon, reacted instantly. She didn't shout a warning. She didn't order him to show his hands again. She didn't ask what he was doing. Her training, her fear, her ingrained biases, they all converged in a fatal split-second decision. She drew her service weapon. "Gun!" she screamed, though Michael held no gun, had made no threat. And before Michael could even register her shout, before he could react or comprehend the catastrophic misinterpretation, she fired. A single shot. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space of the street. The bullet tore through the open window, striking Michael in the chest. He gasped, a look of utter, bewildered shock on his face. His hands flew to the wound, a dark stain blossoming instantly on his light-colored shirt. He slumped forward against the steering wheel, a soft, choking sound escaping his lips. From across the street, hidden in the shadows of a porch, a teenager, who had been watching the stop unfold, phone already recording, screamed, "Oh my God, he shot him! He didn't even give him a chance. He was just reaching for something." Officer Miller stood frozen for a second, gun still extended, smoke curling from the barrel, her face a mask of shock quickly hardening into something else. Defensive justification, perhaps. The ordinary Tuesday evening had just ended in an irreversible tragedy, born from a harmless gesture fatally misread through the lens of fear and bias. The immediate aftermath of the single fatal shot was a maelstrom of confused sounds and frantic activity, all underscored by Officer Miller's own ragged breathing and the sudden, chilling silence from Michael Evans's slumped form. "The teenagers," shouted accusation. "He didn't even give him a chance." Hung in the humid night air, a stark, immediate counter-narrative to whatever justification Miller was already scrambling to form in her own mind. Miller keyed her radio, her voice strained but attempting to project control. Shots fired, suspect down. Officer involved shooting, request backup and medical immediate." She didn't say why she fired, only that she had. Within minutes, the quiet side street was flooded with flashing blue and red lights. Multiple patrol cars converged, sirens wailing, tires screeching. Officers spilled out, weapons drawn, establishing a perimeter, their faces grim, assessing the scene with practiced urgency. A supervising Sergeant Kowalski, a grizzled veteran, known for his loyalty to his officers, was among the first to arrive. He found Miller standing near her patrol car, her service weapon now holstered, but her hands visibly trembling, her face pale and set. Michael Evans was still slumped in the driver's seat of his sedan, unresponsive, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Paramedics were already on scene, alerted by the shots fired call, working frantically but with a grim sense of futility. Sergeant Kowalski's first priority, after confirming the scene was secure, meaning no immediate threat to officers, wasn't solely the victim. It was his officer. He pulled Miller aside, away from the immediate vicinity of Michael's car, away from the growing number of onlookers gathering behind the hastily erected yellow tape, away from the teenager who was now hysterically recounting what he saw to another officer. "Miller, you okay?" Kowalski asked, his voice low, concerned. "What happened? Talk to me." Miller, still visibly shaken, stammered out her initial justification, the one that would become the foundation of the official narrative. He reached, Sarge, furtive movement, towards the floorboard. "I thought he was going for a weapon. I feared for my life. I had to engage." She didn't mention Michael saying, "Something fell." She didn't mention the multi-tool. She just focused on furtive movement. "Feared for my life." The magic words drilled into officers, the phrases that often provided a shield against accountability. Kowalski nodded slowly, his expression unreadable but his mind already working, already strategizing. He'd seen this before, a shooting, a dead civilian, a scared officer. The crucial thing now was to control the narrative, protect the officer, protect the department. "Okay, Miller, okay," he said soothingly, placing a hand briefly on her shoulder. "Listen to me. You were in fear for your life." He made a sudden, threatening move towards a concealed area. "You reacted based on your training, got it?" He wasn't asking, he was telling her the story, coaching her, reinforcing the acceptable script. "We need to secure your body cam footage immediately. And Miller," his voice dropped further, "make sure your official statement emphasizes the furtive movement, the non-compliance leading up to it, okay? Highlight the perceived threat. Those are the key elements." The other officers on scene instinctively began to close ranks. The teenager who witnessed the shooting was interviewed, yes, but his account, contradicting Miller's perceived threat, was subtly downplayed in initial radio traffic and notes. The focus shifted to searching Michael's car, not for his registration, but for any possible weapon that might retroactively justify Miller's actions. They found none, only the small silver multi-tool on the passenger floorboard, which was bagged as potential evidence, but its innocuous nature not highlighted. At the precinct later that night, After Miller had been separated and given time to decompress and consult with her union representative, a standard but often criticized procedure, the process of crafting the official report began. Sergeant Kowalski, along with a union lawyer, sat with Miller as she dictated her statement. The broken tail-light pretext for the stop, while thin, was maintained. Michael Evans was painted as argumentative and non-compliant from the outset, despite no evidence of such in the initial interaction. The crucial moment was described with carefully chosen words. Subject suddenly made a furtive downward movement towards the passenger side floorboard, consistent with reaching for a concealed weapon. Fearing for my immediate safety, I discharged my firearm to neutralize the perceived lethal threat. There was no mention of Michael stating something fell, no mention of her screaming "gun" before firing. The narrative was being meticulously shaped, scrubbed of ambiguities, solidified into a defensible official record. The body camera footage, which Miller had activated upon exiting her vehicle, became a critical piece of this control. Department issue. Policy dictated it be downloaded and logged by a supervisor. Kowalski personally handled Miller's camera. He knew the footage would be scrutinized. He also knew that sometimes, in the heat of the moment, cameras capture unhelpful perspectives. He and Miller reviewed the footage together in a private office before it was officially submitted to the evidence vault. Certain angles, certain sounds, certain officer reactions could be misinterpreted by civilians, by lawyers, by the media, while outright deletion of the entire file was too risky and traceable, ensuring that only the most defensible segments were readily available for initial review, or that any internal preliminary analysis focused on the officer's stated perception of threat was standard operating procedure in situations like this. The blue wall was going up, brick by carefully constructed brick, around Officer Miller, around the department, aiming to bury the truth of Michael Evans's needless death beneath a mountain of official denial and carefully curated evidence. The official narrative, carefully crafted in the hours following Michael Evans's death, began its public dissemination the very next morning. The Oakhaven Police Department, acutely aware of the city's simmering racial tensions and the potential for this shooting to ignite a firestorm, moved quickly to control the initial media cycle. The first press release was terse, clinical, almost deliberately vague. It confirmed an officer-involved shooting during a traffic stop, resulting in the death of an adult male suspect. It stated the officer involved, Karen Miller, had perceived a lethal threat and acted according to training and departmental policy. It emphasized that an internal investigation was underway, as was standard procedure, and that no further details could be released at this time to protect the integrity of the investigation. The language was all carefully chosen. Suspect, not victim. Perceived threat, not objective fact, according to training, implying justification. Simultaneously, unofficial leaks, likely originating from within the department or the police union, began to surface, subtly shaping public perception before Michael's family or any independent. Witnesses had a chance to speak. Anonymous sources close to the investigation hinted to select media outlets that Michael Evans had been uncooperative and had made a sudden, suspicious movement that caused the officer to fear for her life. Crucially, these leaks also highlighted Michael's minor, decade-old marijuana conviction. This detail, legally irrelevant to the circumstances of the shooting, was strategically deployed to tarnish his character, to subtly plant the idea in the public consciousness that he was not an innocent victim, but someone inherently prone to criminality, someone whose presence might naturally arouse suspicion. Early online comment sections and social media threads began to fill with predictable biases. Why was he resisting? Probably had something to hide. Good shoot if he was reaching for something. The racial stereotyping, amplified by the leaked prior offense, began its insidious work of retroactively justifying the unjustifiable. The OPD held a formal press conference later that afternoon. Police Chief Henderson, a political appointee known for his unwavering support of his officers, stood flanked by Officer Miller's union president. Chief Henderson's statement was a masterclass in deflection and coded language. He expressed regret for the loss of life, but immediately pivoted to emphasizing the dangers officers face daily. He spoke of the split-second decisions they must make in volatile situations. He mentioned the traffic stop occurred in a known high-crime area, subtly implying Michael Evans's presence there was inherently suspicious. He stated that Michael Evans matched the general description of a suspect wanted in connection with recent petty thefts in the area, a vague, unverifiable claim designed to further cast doubt on Michael's innocence and justify the initial stop. He repeatedly referenced Officer Miller's excellent service record and her bravery in confronting a perceived threat. When pressed by reporters about eyewitness accounts claiming Michael wasn't aggressive and made no threatening moves, Chief Henderson dismissed them as unreliable or emotionally charged, stating the official investigation, based on officer testimony and evidence recovered at the scene, will determine the facts. He made no mention of the multi-tool found in Michael's car, only that the scene was processed according to procedure. The body camera footage, he stated, was under review and would be released at the appropriate time, likely after the conclusion of the internal investigation, a process known to take months if not years. This deliberate withholding of the footage, even selectively edited portions, further fueled suspicion within the community, but allowed the OPD to control the dominant narrative in the crucial early days. Officer Miller, standing beside the chief, but not speaking, looked pale but resolute, occasionally nodding in agreement, projecting the image of a dedicated officer forced to make a tragic but necessary decision. The public face of the department was one of unwavering support for their officer, a carefully constructed facade designed to withstand the inevitable public outcry and protect the institution from liability and criticism. The spin was in full effect, attempting to bury Michael Evans not just in the ground, but under a mountain of carefully crafted official lies and prejudicial insinuations. Officer Karen Miller sat alone in the sterile quiet of her small, meticulously tidy apartment, the blinds drawn against the harsh afternoon sun. Days had passed since the shooting, days filled with an exhausting blur of internal debriefings, union meetings, and the suffocating weight of public scrutiny. Outwardly, she maintained the composure expected of her, the stoic, professional officer who had faced a lethal threat and acted according to her training. She recited the official narrative: furtive movement, feared for my life, neutralized the threat, so many times to investigators, to her union rep, to herself in the mirror, that the words began to feel like a pre-recorded script, detached from the raw, visceral reality of that rainy night. But in the solitary hours, when the official inquiries paused and the supportive calls from fellow officers stopped, the carefully constructed facade began to crack. The image of Michael Evans's face, his eyes wide with bewildered shock in the split second before she fired, haunted her waking moments and invaded her sleep, morphing into vivid, inescapable nightmares. She would see him slump forward, hear the teenager's accusing scream. He didn't even give him a chance, a phrase that echoed relentlessly in the hollow chambers of her guilt, driven by a desperate, gnawing need to understand, to see. Again, what she had done, she had managed to obtain a copy of her body camera footage from that night, not the officially logged version, but a raw file downloaded to a secure personal drive before Sergeant Kowalski had officially taken possession of the camera at the scene. It was a risky, unauthorized act, a violation of protocol she justified to herself as needing to prepare for the investigation. But the truth was, she needed to confront the ghost. Late at night, when the city was asleep and her apartment felt like a soundproof tomb, she would plug in the drive, her hand trembling slightly, and watch the footage. Over and over again. The video was clear, the audio stark. She saw Michael Evans pull over calmly. She heard his polite, if perhaps slightly wary, responses. She saw his hands, clearly visible on the steering wheel. She heard him say, "Just a sec, officer." Something fell, just before he leaned slightly to his right. His hands in that moment were visible. His left hand remained on the wheel. His right hand moved downwards, towards the passenger floor, in a smooth, non-threatening motion. There was no lunge, no sudden aggressive movement, no glint of a weapon, just a man reaching for something he'd dropped. And then her own voice, loud, panicked, screaming, "Gun!" a word that now sounded utterly unconvincing, even to her own ears, in the context of what the video showed. Followed immediately by the deafening roar of her firearm. Each viewing was a fresh wave of nausea, a cold fist clenching in her gut. The furtive movement she had described so confidently in her official statement, the one she had genuinely perceived in that split second of adrenaline-fueled panic, now looked on the clear, objective recording like a tragically misinterpreted, harmless gesture. The lethal threat she had sworn she faced now seemed like a phantom, a figment of her own fear, amplified by years of ingrained bias and training that often painted young black men as default threats. She remembered the locker room jokes, the casual racism, the dehumanizing language used to describe people from certain neighborhoods. She remembered training scenarios where indistinct shadows in grainy videos were always meant to be interpreted as armed assailants, where hesitation was equated with death. She remembered the subtle and sometimes not so subtle departmental culture that rewarded aggressive, proactive policing in minority communities, that prioritized officer dominance over de-escalation. Had all of that, the jokes, the training, the culture, seeped into her subconscious, shaping her perception, predisposing her to see threat where none existed, especially when confronted by a black man who didn't immediately display the expected level of deference. The realization was sickening. She, Karen Miller, a decorated officer, a woman who prided herself on her professionalism, had killed an innocent man. Killed him because of a mistake. A mistake born not just of a split-second misjudgment, but of a lifetime of societal conditioning and a departmental culture that quietly nurtured racial bias under the guise of officer safety and gut instinct. The weight of this truth was unbearable. She would sit in the darkness, the ghostly images from the body cam flickering on her laptop screen, tears silently tracing paths down her cheeks. The public face she presented was one of justified action. But in the private hell of her apartment, Officer Karen Miller was slowly, agonizingly, being consumed by the undeniable truth of her own fatal error. The blue wall offered her protection from external consequences, but it offered no solace from the internal torment of her own dawning, devastating guilt. While Officer Karen Miller wrestled with her private demons and the OPD carefully managed its public image, the community of Oak Haven, particularly the residents of Willow Creek and surrounding black neighborhoods, refused to let Michael Evans's death be dismissed as just another statistic, another justified officer-involved shooting. The initial shock and grief quickly coalesced into a groundswell of anger and a demand for answers, for justice. Michael wasn't just an adult male suspect, as the initial police reports had so coldly described him. He was a beloved son, a friend, a mentor to local children, a talented artist whose quiet contributions had made their community brighter. His death left a gaping hole, and the official narrative simply didn't align with the Michael they knew. Gentle, patient, respectful. Community leaders, pastors, and local activists, many of whom had long-standing, contentious relationships with the Oak Haven Police Department over issues of racial profiling and excessive force, immediately began to organize. Within days of the shooting, vigils were held at Westwood Park, the site of Michael's death. Candles flickered in the twilight, casting a warm glow on faces etched with sorrow and anger. Michael's parents, heartbroken but resolute, spoke, tearfully not of vengeance, but of their son's gentle spirit and their desperate need for truth and accountability. Local artists, friends of Michael, quickly painted vibrant, powerful murals of his smiling face on boarded-up storefronts and community center walls in Willow Creek, his image becoming an instant symbol of lost potential and systemic injustice. Hashtags like "Justice for Michael Evans" and "Durham Oak Haven police shooting" dominated local social media feeds, filled with personal tributes, demands for the release of Officer Miller's body cam footage, and stories of other negative encounters with OPD officers. The marches began soon after. Thousands of people, black, white, young, old, took to the streets, their voices rising in unison, chanting Michael's name, demanding Officer Miller's arrest, and calling for an independent investigation into the shooting and the department's broader practices. The protests were largely peaceful, organized with a discipline that belied the raw emotion fueling them, but their message was unequivocal. The community would not accept the OPD's carefully constructed narrative without a fight. They carried signs reading, "His hands were visible," "Bias kills," "Release the tapes now," and "Am I next?" The city's carefully managed image of racial harmony was shattered by the visible, audible outpouring of grief and rage, the public. Outcry began to fracture alliances that had previously seemed solid. While the police union and many conservative commentators reflexively defended Officer Miller, citing the dangers of policing and emphasizing her fear for her life, a growing number of Oakhaven's white residents, particularly younger ones, and those in more progressive circles, began to publicly question the OPD's account. Moved by the powerful community response, the stories of Michael's life, and the persistent questions about the withheld body cam footage, they started attending vigils, amplifying the calls for transparency on their own social media, and writing letters to city council members. Some local businesses put up signs expressing solidarity with the Evans family. The usual us versus them narrative, often successfully deployed by police departments after controversial shootings, wasn't holding as firmly this time. Michael's well-documented community involvement and the sheer senselessness of a fatal shooting during a routine traffic stop for an alleged minor infraction resonated beyond the usual activist circles. Within the Oakhaven Police Department itself, subtle fissures began to appear. While the official stance remained one of unwavering support for Officer Miller, pending the internal investigation, whispers and private conversations revealed a more complex reality. Some younger officers, particularly officers of color, expressed quiet discomfort with the department's handling of the situation and Miller's history of aggressive tactics. They had seen officers like Miller operate before, officers whose gut instincts too often aligned with racial stereotypes. The pressure to maintain the blue wall of silence was immense, but the blatant injustice of Michael Evans's death, coupled with the intense public scrutiny, was causing some to question their loyalties. Conversely, a hardline contingent within the department doubled down, viewing the protests as anti-police sentiment, seeing Miller as a scapegoat and resenting the external pressure. The locker room jokes Miller remembered now likely took on a more defensive, embittered tone. The department, like the city it served, was becoming increasingly polarized, the fault lines of race, power, and justice cracking wider with each passing day, each new protest, each unanswered question about what truly happened on that dimly lit side street. The community wasn't just demanding answers, it was demanding a fundamental change in how it was policed. The weight of her secret, the unbearable truth of Michael Evans's innocent death at her hands, became a relentless torment for Officer Karen Miller. The carefully constructed official narrative offered no solace. The solidarity of the blue wore no shield against the consuming fire of her own guilt. Sleep offered no escape. Nightmares plagued her, vivid recurring images of Michael's bewildered face, his hands clearly visible, her own voice screaming, "Gun!" followed by the deafening roar of her firearm. Sometimes in these nightmares, Michael wouldn't just slump silently. He would turn to her, his eyes filled not with fear but with a profound, sorrowful accusation, and whisper, "Why, officer? I was just reaching. You didn't even look. You just saw me." He'd sometimes call her racist in these dreams, the word echoing, confirming her deepest, most terrifying fear about the true root of her fatal misjudgment. She would wake up gasping, drenched in cold sweat, the phantom smell of gunpowder in her nostrils. During the day, she went through the motions of her administrative leave, attending mandatory counseling sessions where she recited the official story, her voice hollow even to her own ears. She met with her union lawyer, who reassured her that the department would back her, that the internal investigation would likely clear her, that eyewitness accounts were notoriously unreliable. But his reassurances felt like empty platitudes against the stark, undeniable reality she replayed endlessly from the unauthorized copy of her body cam footage. The footage didn't lie. His hands were visible. He had said something about an item falling. Her scream of "gun" was a panicked fabrication, a retroactive justification born of fear and bias, not objective threat. The multi-tool found in his car, initially presented as potential evidence, was now a cruel mockery, a symbol of the harmless object he was likely reaching for. The public outcry, the murals of Michael's face appearing all over the city, the passionate calls for justice. She tried to ignore them, to dismiss them as uninformed emotionalism, as anti-police rhetoric. But she couldn't escape his image, his gentle smile now a constant silent rebuke. She saw him in the faces of other young black men she passed on the street during her rare ventures outside her apartment, each one a potential victim of the same flawed perceptions that resided within her, within the department. The realization that her split-second, bias-driven decision had not only ended an innocent life, but had also betrayed every oath she had ever taken, every ideal she once believed. She stood for, began to unravel her from the inside out. The guilt was a living thing gnawing at her, suffocating her. The support of her colleagues felt tainted, conditional on her upholding the lie. The official narrative felt like a suffocating shroud. One night, after another, harrowing, sleepless, stretch-filled with nightmares and the relentless replay of the body cam footage, something inside Karen Miller finally broke. It was well past midnight, her apartment cloaked in oppressive silence. She couldn't bear the weight of the deception any longer. The thought of living the rest of her life with this lie, of allowing an innocent man's memory to be tarnished by her false justifications, of potentially seeing another officer make the same fatal mistake because the system refused to acknowledge the truth. It was too much. Driven by a desperate, almost feverish need for catharsis, for some form of atonement, however inadequate, she reached for her personal cell phone. Her hands trembled as she opened the video recording app. She propped the phone against a stack of books on her kitchen table, hit record, and stared into the small lens, her face pale, her eyes hollow and red-rimmed. "My name is Karen Miller," she began, her voice barely a whisper, raw with unshed tears and exhaustion. "I'm a police officer with the Oakhaven Police Department, and I killed Michael Evans." The words, spoken aloud for the first time, hung heavy in the silent room. She took a ragged breath and continued, the confession pouring out of her, in a torrent of grief and self-recrimination. She recounted the traffic stop, her initial assumptions, Michael's calm demeanor. She confessed to misinterpreting his harmless gesture. She admitted, her voice cracking, that he had said something about an item falling, that his hands were visible, that he posed no threat. "I didn't see a gun," she choked out. I reacted. I saw him, a black man, reaching, and so I assumed the worst. My training, if the things you hear, I shot him. It was my fault, my bias. He didn't do anything wrong." She detailed the pressure from Sergeant Kowalski to frame the narrative, the crafting of the false report, the subtle manipulation of the body cam review process. She spoke for nearly 20 minutes, a rambling, tearful, utterly devastating admission of her fatal error, her prejudice, and the systemic pressures that encouraged the cover-up. When she finally finished, emotionally and physically drained, she stopped the recording. She stared at the video file on her phone for a long moment, a strange sense of terrifying liberation washing over her. She didn't know what she would do with it yet. Maybe send it to her lawyer, to internal affairs. But then, with a sudden, impulsive clarity, she knew this couldn't be managed, contained, or negotiated. It had to be raw, unfiltered. She opened her anonymous social media burner account, the one she rarely used, attached the video file, and wrote a simple, stark caption. "The truth about Michael Evans, from Officer Karen Miller." And then, with a trembling finger, she hit post. The confession, her career, the department's carefully constructed narrative, everything was about to go irreversibly, explosively viral. The internet, as it so often does, acted as an instantaneous, unsparing accelerant. Officer Karen Miller's late-night video confession, posted from an anonymous burner account, but explicitly identifying herself and the victim, Michael Evans, began its digital journey slowly at first, a single flickering ember in the vast expanse of social media. But it didn't take long for someone, perhaps a local activist monitoring Oakhaven police-related hashtags, a night owl journalist, or just a random citizen scrolling through their feed, to recognize the explosive significance of what they were seeing. The raw, tearful admission from a uniformed, in her profile picture at least, police officer confessing to killing an innocent man due to racial bias and detailing an official cover-up was pure dynamite. Within minutes, the video was being shared, then reshared, then shared again at an exponential rate. Screenshots of Miller's anguished face, key quotes transcribed and highlighted, began appearing on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. The initial trickle became a stream, then a river, then an uncontrollable torrent. By the time the sun began to rise over Oakhaven, WAGSH Officer Miller confession and March of Truth for Michael Evans were trending nationally. Major news outlets, alerted by their social media monitoring teams and flooded with tips, scrambled to verify the video's authenticity. Reporters camped outside OPD headquarters and Miller's apartment building. The city's official communication channels, usually so adept at controlling the narrative, were completely blindsided, overwhelmed. The Oakhaven Police Department and the mayor's office awoke to a full-blown crisis, a public relations catastrophe unfolding in real time on a global stage. Chief Henderson, who had gone to bed believing the situation while Sirius was being managed through controlled internal processes, was reportedly aghast, furious, and terrified. The carefully constructed official story, the furtive movement, the officer fearing for her life, was instantly irrevocably demolished by Miller's own words, broadcast directly to the world. There was no spinning this, no denying it. The confession came from the shooter herself, raw and uncoerced. The department's attempts to withhold or selectively edit bodycam footage now looked like a deliberate, cynical cover-up, precisely as Miller had described. The blue wall of silence hadn't just been breached, it had been dynamited from within by one of its own. The reaction from Michael Evans's family and the community was a potent mixture of vindication, profound grief, and renewed outrage. Vindication because Miller's confession confirmed what they had known in their hearts all along, that Michael was innocent, that he had been unjustly killed. Grief because the confession laid bare the senseless, bias-driven nature of his death, and outrage because it exposed the depth of the deception, the systemic effort to protect a guilty officer and tarnish an innocent man's memory. Community. Leaders immediately called for Chief Henderson's resignation, for the immediate arrest of Officer Miller on murder charges, and for a full-scale, independent federal investigation into the Oakhaven Police Department's patterns and practices. The planned marches and protests swelled to unprecedented numbers, fueled by the undeniable proof of injustice straight from the officer's mouth. Within the OPD, chaos reigned. Officers who had privately supported Miller, or at least defended her right to due process, now felt betrayed, exposed and deeply vulnerable. The confession implicated not just Miller, but Sergeant Kowalski for coaching her statement, and by extension, the entire departmental culture that enabled such cover-ups. Trust among officers fractured. Some felt Miller had betrayed the badge, the brotherhood-sisterhood, by breaking ranks so publicly. Others, perhaps those with their own buried discomfort about departmental practices, felt a grudging, terrified respect for her act of self-immolation, even as they feared the consequences for themselves and the institution. The police union, which had been preparing a vigorous defense of Miller, found itself in an impossible position, its usual talking points about officer safety and split-second decisions rendered meaningless by Miller's own admission of bias and error. They quickly issued a statement condemning Miller's confessed actions, while still lamenting the unauthorized release of her statement, attempting to distance the broader union membership from her individual culpability, a transparent attempt at damage control that few found convincing. City officials from the mayor down scrambled to respond, their carefully crafted statements of ongoing investigation and commitment to transparency now sounding laughably inadequate. The viral detonation of Miller's guilt had irrevocably changed the landscape, turning a local tragedy into a national referendum on race, policing, and the possibility of truth emerging, even from within the most fortified walls of denial. The viral confession acted as a powerful corrosive agent, eating away at the Oakhaven Police Department's credibility and forcing an institutional reckoning that many thought impossible. Chief Henderson, facing relentless public pressure city, council inquiries, and likely back-channel ultimatums from state and even federal authorities, alerted by the national outcry, announced his resignation within 72 hours of the video's release. His departure signaled the depth of the crisis, an admission that the leadership had failed catastrophically. An interim chief was appointed, tasked with the Herculean effort of restoring public trust and cooperating with the multiple external investigations that were now inevitable. The district attorney, who had initially been proceeding cautiously with the investigation into Michael Evans's death, relying heavily on the OPD's internal findings, was now compelled to take immediate, decisive action. Officer Karen Miller, already on administrative leave, was formally arrested and charged with manslaughter and official misconduct. The charge wasn't murder, much to the disappointment of some activists, but it was a significant criminal charge against an officer for an on-duty shooting, a rarity in Oakhaven and indeed nationally. Her confession video became Exhibit A. Sergeant Kowalski was also suspended and faced an intense internal and potential criminal investigation for his role in coaching Miller's initial statement and potentially encouraging a cover-up. The blue wall hadn't just cracked. It was showing signs of collapsing under the weight of Miller's self-incriminating truth. The U.S. Department of Justice, citing the egregious nature of the confessed bias and the apparent systemic failures within the OPD, announced it was opening a full pattern and practice investigation into the Oakhaven Police Department. This was the federal intervention many community leaders had long called for, a deep dive into the department's training, disciplinary procedures, use of force, incidents and data on racial disparities in stops, arrests and outcomes. The DOJ's involvement promised a level of scrutiny and potential for mandated reform that local efforts had consistently failed to achieve. Files were subpoenaed, officers and commanders were compelled to testify, and the entire culture of the OPD was placed under a federal microscope. For Michael Evans's family, the developments brought a complex wave of emotions. The confirmation of Michael's innocence and Miller's culpability was a profound, painful vindication. Yet it didn't bring Michael back. His mother, speaking at a press conference organized by community leaders, tearfully acknowledged Miller's confession as a necessary step, but emphasized that true justice required not just one officer's conviction, but fundamental, systemic change to prevent such tragedies from happening again. "My son was a good man," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "He deserved to live. He deserved to be seen as a human being, not a threat. Officer Miller's confession is a start, but the work is far from over. We need to change the system that taught her to see my son as less." The case also had an unexpected ripple effect, emboldening others who felt they had been victims of Officer Miller's or other OPD officers' misconduct. With the department's credibility shattered and the DOJ investigating, more citizens came forward with their own stories of harassment, excessive force, and biased policing. Some of these older cases, previously dismissed or ignored, were reopened, examined with fresh eyes in light of the new revelations. The institutional fallout was spreading, forcing a painful but necessary confrontation with a history of unaddressed grievances. Karen Miller herself remained largely isolated, her career over, facing criminal charges and public condemnation. Her confession, while perhaps bringing her a measure of personal catharsis, had unleashed a firestorm that consumed her professional life and irrevocably altered the landscape of policing in Oakhaven. She became a pariah to many of her former colleagues, a symbol of betrayal. Yet to some observers, particularly those outside law enforcement, she became a complicated, almost tragic figure, an officer who had committed a terrible act, fueled by systemic bias, but who ultimately, at great personal cost, chose to break the code of silence and speak a devastating truth. Her journey towards legal justice was just beginning, but her confession had already set in motion a chain of events that promised a broader, though undoubtedly difficult path towards institutional accountability. The criminal trial of former Officer Karen Miller became a focal point for the nation's ongoing conversation about race, policing, and justice. Her confession video, played in court, was undeniably powerful, leaving jurors visibly shaken. The easy prosecution meticulously laid out the events of that night, corroborating Miller's admissions with evidence from the scene, the testimony of the teenage eyewitness, who was finally fully believed, and expert analysis on implicit bias in policing. Miller's defense attorney, while not contesting the core facts of the shooting as confessed, attempted to argue for diminished responsibility, citing the intense pressures of policing, inadequate departmental training on bias, and a momentary lapse in judgment, rather than malicious intent. They painted her as a product of a flawed system, now taking the fall for its collective sins, highlighting her eventual remorse and confession as evidence of her underlying character. The jury, after several days of deliberation, found Karen Miller guilty of voluntary manslaughter and official misconduct. The verdict was met with mixed reactions. For Michael Evans's family and many community activists, it was a measure of justice, a rare instance of an officer being held criminally accountable for an on-duty killing. Yet, the manslaughter conviction, rather than murder, felt insufficient. To some, a reflection of the high bar still required to convict police officers for lethal force. Miller was later sentenced to a significant prison term, though less than the maximum, the judge acknowledging her confession and remorse as mitigating factors while condemning her fatal bias. The Department of Justice's pattern and practice investigation into the Oak Haven Police Department continued for over a year, culminating in a scathing report that detailed systemic deficiencies in training, supervision, accountability, and community engagement, particularly concerning interactions with minority communities. The report mandated a federally monitored consent decree, forcing the OPD to implement sweeping reforms, from revised use of force policies and enhanced de-escalation training to improved data collection on stops and searches, and the establishment of a more robust and independent civilian oversight body. The consent decree was a legally binding agreement, promising years of federal oversight and a difficult, protracted process of attempting to rebuild trust between the police and the community they served. The national media, which had initially focused on the sensational aspects of Miller's confession, began to delve deeper into the systemic issues her case exposed. Documentaries were produced, long-form articles written, examining the culture of policing in Oak Haven as a microcosm of broader national problems. Families of other individuals killed or brutalized by OPD officers in past incidents found new platforms to share their stories, their previously dismissed claims now viewed through the lens of Miller's confession and the DOJ's findings. A painful public reckoning was underway, forcing the city to confront uncomfortable truths about its history and the deep-seated nature of racial bias within its institutions. For Karen Miller, now an inmate, the future was bleak. Her life she knew it was over. She reportedly spent her time in prison in relative isolation, haunted by her actions, participating in restorative justice programs when available, and attempting to come to terms with the irreversible consequences of her fatal mistake. Whether her confession was born purely of guilt, a desire for atonement, or a complex mix of motivations, its impact was undeniable. She had broken the code, and in doing so had inadvertently become a catalyst for a level of scrutiny and reform that Oak Haven had never before experienced. The final scenes of this chapter of Oak Haven's story are ones of stark contrast. One image might be Karen Miller, alone in her cell, the weight of her actions a permanent shadow. Another might be Michael Evans' parents, finding a quiet strength in community advocacy, working to ensure their son's legacy was one of positive change, not just tragic loss. And a final image, a community rally months later still demanding justice, still pushing for the full implementation of the consent decree reforms, their voices united, more powerful than before. The journey was far from over. Officer Miller's confession had ripped the veil off a deeply flawed system, but the hard work of dismantling that system and building something new, something truly just, was an ongoing struggle, leaving viewers to ponder whether lasting change was truly possible, or if the cycle of bias and tragedy would inevitably repeat. A single shot, fired in a split second of perceived fear, fueled by Years of ingrained bias, a life extinguished, a community shattered. Officer Karen Miller thought her actions, her story, would be protected by the silence of the blue wall, by the weight of official narratives. She never imagined the loudest voice exposing the lie would be her own, driven by the unbearable weight of guilt. For those of us who have witnessed the devastating impact of racial bias in policing, who have seen official stories crumble under the weight of truth, who yearn for accountability not just for individual officers, but for the systems that shape them, this story is a painful but potent reminder. We know that the fight for justice is relentless, that true change is hard-won. Maybe you've felt the despair of seeing injustice go unpunished. Maybe you've questioned if the truth can ever truly break through entrenched defenses. Maybe you've wondered if anyone within the system itself will ever choose conscience over code. But Officer Miller's extraordinary confession, however complex its motivations, shows that even within the most fortified institutions, the human conscience can at times become an unstoppable force. It demonstrates that the truth, once unleashed, has a power of its own, capable of dismantling lies and forcing a reckoning, however uncomfortable. It highlights the courage and the profound personal cost of breaking ranks and speaking out against injustice from within. This wasn't just about one officer's guilt, it was about the system that created her, the biases that armed her, and the community that demanded better. It reminds us that while the path to justice is long and fraught, moments of profound truth can illuminate the way forward. So if this story moved you, if it challenged you, if it gave you a glimmer of hope that even the most deeply buried truths can find their way to light, please share this powerful narrative. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded of the corrosive nature of bias, the immense courage it takes to confront one's own wrongdoing, and the enduring power of truth in the fight for a more just world. Until next time, keep questioning, keep demanding accountability, and never lose hope in the possibility of change.